Imagine a newborn baby, barely an hour old, placed on a damp, rat-infested floor while its mother works 12 hours in a factory. The air reeks of sewage, and the shrieks of starving children echo through the alleys. In the Rookeries of Victorian London, this was not rare. It was normal. And for most, there was no escape. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's 1850. London, the greatest city in the world, they say. Capital of the British Empire, a beacon of progress and civilization. But step just 3 streets away from the grand boulevards and glittering shops, and you enter a different world entirely. A world that exists in shadow. A world that smells of death before you even see it. The Rookeries, Victorian London's festering slums. Places with names that sound almost poetic. Seven Dials, St. Giles, Jacob's Island, the Old Nicole. But behind those names lies suffering so profound, so absolute, that even describing it feels inadequate. This is where the forgotten lived, where they struggled, where they died, often young, often alone. And today, you're going to walk those streets with me. You're going to breathe that air. You're going to feel what it meant to be trapped in Victorian hell. Let's begin on a typical morning in St. Giles, one of London's most notorious rookeries. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the darkness never truly lifts here anyway. The buildings lean toward each other across narrow alleys, so close their upper floors nearly touch, blocking out what little light dares to penetrate this labyrinth of human misery. The buildings themselves are relics from another century, sagging timber frames and crumbling brick, held together by little more than habit and desperation. They weren't built as slums. Once, perhaps centuries ago, they housed respectable families. But as London exploded in population during the Industrial Revolution, as tens of thousands flooded in from the countryside seeking work, these old structures were subdivided again and again and again. 1 room became 2. 2 became 4. Families of 8 or 10 crammed into spaces 12 feet square. And in the worst rookeries, even that was luxury. Listen. Do you hear that sound? It's the constant drip of water, not clean water. Never clean. This is the runoff from the floors above, seeping through rotten floorboards, carrying with it the waste of dozens of people living in conditions that would make a medieval peasant weep. The walls are slick with moisture, green with mold that grows in thick, fuzzy patches. Touch those walls, and your hand comes away damp and cold, smelling of rot and human waste. The buildings have no proper drainage, no ventilation, no sanitation systems. Chamber pots are emptied out of windows into the alleys below, where the sewage combines with industrial runoff, dead animals, and rainwater to create a thick, black sludge that never fully dries. In summer, the heat bakes this mixture into a crust that cracks beneath your feet. In winter, it freezes into treacherous sheets of ice contaminated with every disease you can imagine, and several you probably can't. Now breathe in. Actually, don't. The smell would overwhelm you instantly. It's not just unpleasant, it's a physical assault. The stench of human waste dominates, yes, but layered beneath that are a dozen other odors competing for your attention. The sickly, sweet smell of rotting flesh. Rats mostly, but sometimes larger animals, occasionally even human bodies that went undiscovered for days or weeks. The acrid tang of coal smoke hanging thick in the air, burning your throat and eyes. The smell of unwashed bodies, of clothing worn day after day, week after week, never cleaned because cleaning requires water and fuel and time that nobody has. The smell of disease, that peculiar sour odor that clings to the chronically ill. And underneath it all, the wet, mouldy smell of decay, as if the buildings themselves are slowly dying from the inside out. Walk deeper into the rookery now. The alley narrows further, until you could touch both walls with your outstretched arms. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, littered with debris nobody bothered to remove. Broken pottery, scraps of rotted wood, bones picked clean by rats and dogs, the occasional piece of cloth too worn and filthy even for the rag and bone men who usually take anything. Watch your step here, because the ground is slippery, treacherous. People have broken ankles on these cobblestones. Children have fallen and cracked their skulls open. And in the darkness, predators of both the human and animal variety wait for the unwary. A door opens ahead of you. Not a proper door, mind you. This one hangs on a single hinge, a piece of warped wood that doesn't quite fit its frame, held closed at night by a bent nail or a piece of rope. A woman emerges. She's perhaps 25, though she looks 40. Her face is gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin the colour of old parchment. Her eyes are sunken, ringed with dark circles that speak of sleepless nights and constant worry. She wears a dress that might once have been brown but is now an indeterminate shade of grey-black, patched and repatched until the original fabric has nearly disappeared. No shoes. Her feet are bare, hardened and cracked from years of walking on rough surfaces. In her arms, she carries a baby. The infant is silent. Too silent. Healthy babies cry. This one barely moves, its tiny face slack, its breathing shallow. Malnutrition, disease, or both. She doesn't meet your eyes as she passes. Nobody here meets anyone's eyes. That's a luxury, connection, recognition of shared humanity. Here, everyone is too focused on their own survival. Follow her. She's heading to the communal water pump 3 streets away. This pump serves perhaps 2,000 people, maybe more. It's one of the few sources of water in this entire district, and the water it provides is contaminated. The pump draws from a well that's been polluted by the very cesspits and sewers that surround it. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all of them flow freely through this water supply. But what choice do people have? Drink contaminated water or die of thirst. When you phrase it like that, the choice becomes simple. At least contaminated water offers the possibility of survival. Thirst offers only certainty. The woman joins a line of others, mostly women and children, waiting their turn. They don't speak. What is there to say? Everyone here shares the same struggle, the same daily battle against death. Words feel pointless. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, stands behind the woman with the baby. She carries a chipped ceramic jug that's too large for her small frame. She'll fill it and carry it back. The weight straining her underdeveloped muscles, likely to a family that sent her out to work rather than sending her to school. Education is a fantasy here. Learning to read won't fill your belly. It won't pay the rent, and the rent must be paid. Every single week, the rent collector comes, and if you can't pay, you're out on the street. And as bad as these rooms are, the street is worse. At least a room offers walls. The street offers nothing but cold pavement and almost certain death. If this reality shocks you, if you're struggling to imagine human beings living like this in one of the world's wealthiest cities, hit that like button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because we're just getting started. Let's talk about the rooms themselves, the places where families somehow attempted to build lives amid the ruins. Enter one now, following a father who's just returned from his night shift at the docks. He's been loading ships for 14 hours straight, his back screaming in agony, his hands bleeding from the rough work. He's earned sixpence for 14 hours of back-breaking labour. That's barely enough to pay for food for his family for 2 days. The rent alone costs 3 shillings a week, and he has a wife and 4 children to feed. The mathematics of poverty are brutal and unforgiving. He pushes open that broken door, and you step inside with him. The room is perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. This is the entire world for 6 human beings. Along one wall, a heap of straw covered with rags serves as the family bed. All 6 of them sleep there, huddled together for warmth in winter, sweltering in summer. There's no proper bed frame, no mattress, certainly no separate beds for the children. Privacy is an alien concept. Everything happens in this single room. Sleeping, eating, dressing, undressing, childbirth, death, even marital relations. The children learn very early to pretend they're asleep when their parents need intimate time. Against another wall sits a small table, one leg shorter than the others. propped up with a brick. 2 stools, both rickety. That's all the furniture. There's no stove, just a small fireplace, but they can't afford much coal. Most meals are eaten cold. When they do cook, usually once every few days, the smoke has nowhere to go. The room has one small window, but it's been broken for months, patched with old newspaper that does little to keep out the wind and rain. In winter, frost forms on the inside of the walls. The father's wife is awake despite the early hour. She's been up all night sewing shirts for a contractor who pays her 3p per dozen. Her fingers are raw and bleeding, pricked by the needle countless times, but she can't stop. She needs to finish 20 dozen this week to earn enough for food. At this pace, sewing in near darkness by the light of a single tallow candle, she'll damage her eyesight permanently within a few years. But what choice does she have? The family needs every penny they can scrape together. 3 of the children are awake too. The oldest boy, age 9, is getting ready to leave for his job at a match factory. He'll spend the next 12 hours dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus, breathing in the toxic fumes that will, within a few years, cause his jaw to literally rot away from his skull in a condition called phossy jaw. He'll lose his teeth first, then the bone itself will begin to decay, and eventually his face will become a suppurating mass of necrotic tissue. He'll die in agony, likely before he reaches 20. But right now, he's 9, and he earns 4p a day, and that 4p means his younger siblings might eat. The 2 middle children, girls aged 7 and 5, will go with their mother today to pick oakum at the workhouse. This is one of the tasks assigned to the desperately poor who seek relief from the parish. They'll sit for 10 hours, their small fingers pulling apart old rope fibre by fibre until their hands are shredded and bloody. It's monotonous, painful work designed as much to punish poverty as to provide relief from it. The Victorian poor law system operates on a principle of less eligibility, meaning that conditions for those receiving aid must always be worse than the conditions of the poorest independent labourer. The message is clear. Poverty is your fault, and we'll make sure you suffer for it. The youngest child, a boy of 3, lies on the straw bed. He's not moving. His skin is hot to the touch. His breathing laboured. Fever. It came on suddenly 2 days ago, and now he's barely conscious. The father looks at him, and something breaks behind his eyes. He's seen this before. His firstborn child, a daughter, died at age 4 from scarlet fever. Another son died at 6 months from cholera. This might be typhus, or consumption, or any of a dozen other diseases that flourish in these conditions. They can't afford a doctor. A doctor's visit costs more than the family earns in a week. So they wait, they pray, and usually, for the very young and the very old, waiting ends in death. Could you make the choices these parents face every day? Which child to feed when there's not enough food for everyone? Whether to spend your last pennies on medicine for a sick child or food for the healthy ones? Whether to send your 7-year-old daughter to work in a factory where she might lose a limb to machinery or keep her home where she'll contribute nothing to the family's survival? The Rookeries strip away all pretense of civilization. They reduce human existence to its most fundamental calculations. Survival. Nothing more. There's no space here for dreams, for aspirations, for hopes of a better future. There's only today, this moment, this room, this constant battle against hunger and cold and disease, and the terrible knowledge that no matter how hard you fight, the odds are stacked impossibly against you. Step outside again into that narrow alley. It's full now, teeming with humanity. The Rookeries are most active in the early morning hours, that brief window before most people leave for work. Children are everywhere, playing in the sewage, barefoot and dressed in rags that barely cover their bodies. Watch that group of boys over there, maybe 5 or 6 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. They're playing a game with a dead rat, kicking it back and forth like a ball. They're laughing. Even here, even in this place, children find ways to play. The human spirit's capacity for resilience is remarkable and heartbreaking, but not all the children are playing. See that girl standing in a doorway? She's perhaps 11, though her body is already developing the shape of a woman. She's painted her lips with something, berry juice maybe, to make them redder. She's wearing a dress that's too large for her, and she watches the alley with eyes that have seen far too much. Child prostitution is rampant in the Rookeries. Girls as young as 9 or 10 sell their bodies for pennies, sometimes just for a piece of bread. The Victorian age has elaborate moral codes about female purity and virtue, but those codes don't apply here. Here, virtue is a luxury nobody can afford. Survival trumps morality. Always. A gang of young men rounds the corner. Not men, really. Boys, most of them teenagers, but hardened by lives that have given them nothing and taken everything. They move with a kind of predatory confidence, scanning the alley for opportunities. Thieves, pickpockets, sometimes violent criminals. The Rookeries are havens for criminal activity because they're virtually impenetrable to police. The alleys are so narrow, so twisted, that outsiders get lost immediately. Even if police do venture in, they rarely go beyond the main passages. Deep in the heart of the Rookeries, in the courtyards and back rooms, crime flourishes unchecked. It's a parallel economy where stolen goods are fenced, where burglars plan their jobs, where people wanted for serious crimes can disappear completely. These young criminals aren't evil, though Victorian society certainly labels them as such. They're products of their environment. Born into places where honest work pays starvation wages, where death is cheap and life is cheaper, what choice do they have? Steal or starve? The decision writes itself. Some of these boys started as simple pickpockets, dipping into the pockets of wealthy gentlemen who ventured too close to the Rookery borders. The more skilled ones can lift a wallet, a watch, a handkerchief without the mark ever feeling a thing. They learned their trade from older criminals, boys and men, who saw potential and taught them the skills they needed to survive. It's the only apprenticeship system that functions reliably in the Rookeries. But petty theft only pays so much. As the boys grow older, as they become more desperate or more ambitious, the crimes escalate. Burglary, armed robbery, sometimes murder, if a job goes wrong or if someone tries to fight back. Society condemns them certainly. The law hunts them relentlessly. Getting caught means transportation to Australia if you're lucky, hanging if you're not. But what does society expect? You trap thousands of people in conditions of absolute destitution. You offer them no legitimate path to escape. You treat them as less than human, and then you're surprised when they turn to crime. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Support this channel with a super thanks to help us bring more hidden history to light. These stories matter. These lives mattered. Walk further into the Rookery now, toward one of the central courtyards. These courtyards are the beating heart of the slums, open spaces surrounded by tenements on all sides. Open is relative, of course. They're usually no more than 30 feet across, sometimes less, perpetually in shadow, the ground covered in that same toxic mixture of sewage, garbage, and industrial waste. In the centre of this particular courtyard stands a shared outhouse. Well, outhouse is too generous a term. It's a cesspit, really, a hole in the ground that serves perhaps 300 people. It's never emptied. When it gets too full, people just stop using it and find other places to relieve themselves. The smell is indescribable. The health consequences are catastrophic. Around this courtyard, life unfolds in all its brutal complexity. Women lean out of windows, their faces hollow with exhaustion, sometimes calling down to neighbours, sometimes just staring blankly at nothing. In one corner, a man sits with his head in his hands. He lost his job 2 weeks ago when the factory where he worked installed new machinery. He's been looking for work every day since, but there's nothing. His savings, the few shillings he'd managed to put aside, are gone. In 3 days, the rent collector will come, and he'll be evicted. He knows what comes next. The workhouse, that hated institution that tears families apart, separating men from women, parents from children, imposing brutal discipline and soul-crushing work in exchange for basic sustenance. Or the street, where death comes quickly, especially in winter. A woman rushes across the courtyard, carrying a bucket. The bucket contains laundry that she's just finished scrubbing in contaminated water from the pump. She's a washerwoman, one of the few legitimate occupations available to poor women. She works for wealthier families in the better parts of London, collecting their dirty clothes, washing them, and returning them cleaned. The irony is cruel. She spends her days handling the fine linens of the rich, garments made of fabrics so soft and delicate she could never afford them, washing away stains from dinner parties she'll never attend, then returns to her rookery room, where her own children wear rags that haven't been properly cleaned in months. She earns perhaps 6 shillings a week for this work, barely enough to survive, and her hands are permanently red and raw from constant immersion in harsh lye soap. In another doorway, a very old man sits on a broken chair. He's probably in his 50s, though he looks 80. Poverty ages people rapidly. He's a crossing sweeper, one of those ubiquitous figures of Victorian London who stand at busy intersections sweeping the street clean of horse dung and mud, hoping that pedestrians crossing will toss them a penny for their trouble. It's not really a job, it's formalised begging. On a good day, he might earn 3p. On a bad day, nothing. He's been doing this for 20 years, ever since an accident at a construction site left him with a limp that made other work impossible. He'll die in the workhouse. He knows this. Everyone knows this. That's where people like him go when their bodies finally give out completely. The workhouse or a pauper's grave, dumped into a pit with a dozen other nameless bodies. A child's scream pierces the air. It's a sound of pain, not play. Everyone in the courtyard looks up, locates the source, a window on the 3rd floor, and then looks away again. No one goes to investigate. No one intervenes. Privacy, even the privacy of suffering, is respected here because everyone understands that nobody wants outsiders witnessing their worst moments. Maybe a child is being beaten by a frustrated parent pushed beyond endurance. Maybe someone is sick or injured. Maybe it's something worse. But you don't ask. You don't look. You grant others the mercy of anonymity in their pain because you hope they'll extend the same courtesy to you. Disease is the constant companion of rookery life. The conditions are perfect for every pathogen known to Victorian medicine and several that won't be identified for another century. Cholera sweeps through regularly, transmitted by the contaminated water supply. The symptoms are horrific. Violent diarrhea and vomiting that dehydrate the body with terrifying speed. Within hours, a healthy person can become a withered husk, their skin turning blue, their eyes sinking deep into their skull, their body racked with painful cramps. Death can come in less than a day. And it's not unusual for entire families to die within a week, one after another, as the disease spreads through shared water sources and close living quarters. Typhoid fever is equally common and equally deadly. The fever climbs for days, becoming so intense that patients become delirious, hallucinating, crying out to people who aren't there. Some recover after weeks of illness, their bodies wasted away to nothing, their hair falling out in clumps. Many don't recover at all. Tuberculosis, called consumption in Victorian times, is perhaps the worst because it kills slowly. Months, sometimes years of progressive decline. The cough that never stops. The blood on handkerchiefs. The weight loss that turns people into walking skeletons. The fever that comes every evening like clockwork. Entire families contract it, passing it between them in their crowded rooms, and entire families watch each other die, one by one, powerless to stop it. And then there are the diseases of malnutrition. Rickets, which bows children's legs and softens their bones. Scurvy, which makes gums bleed and teeth fall out. General wasting diseases that have no specific name but are simply the result of bodies not receiving enough nutrition to function. Children's bellies swell with fluid even as their limbs become stick thin. Their hair loses its colour and texture, becoming brittle and strange. They stop growing. their development stalls. And their parents watch, knowing exactly what's happening, knowing exactly what needs to happen to fix it. Food, proper food, nutritious food, and knowing they can't provide it. Infant mortality in the Rookeries is staggering. More than half of all children born here die before their 5th birthday. Let that sink in for a moment. More than half. If you were born in a London rookery in the mid-19th century, you had a better than even chance of being dead before you could remember anything about your life. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, measles. Simple respiratory infections that wealthier children shrug off. Malnutrition that makes every illness more dangerous. Accidents, falls, burns, drownings in the Thames, and sometimes simple neglect. Because when a mother is working 16 hours a day, just to earn enough to feed her family, supervision becomes impossible. Can you imagine burying child after child? Can you imagine the emotional calculus that parents must perform? The way they have to guard their hearts, knowing that loving too deeply means suffering too profoundly when the inevitable happens? Some mothers openly admit they don't allow themselves to become too attached to infants because the odds of those infants surviving are so poor. It's a defense mechanism, a way to preserve sanity in conditions that destroy it. But imagine what it does to a person to feel that way. Imagine what it does to a child to grow up sensing that their parents are holding back, unable or unwilling to love them fully because they might die tomorrow. The Rookeries are also places of addiction. When your daily reality is this grim, when every waking moment is a struggle against hunger, cold, disease, and despair, the temptation to escape, even temporarily, becomes overwhelming. Gin is everywhere. Gin palaces, as the pubs are called, line the borders of the Rookeries, their facades bright and inviting, promising warmth and forgetfulness for just a few pennies. The gin they serve is often adulterated, mixed with turpentine or sulfuric acid to increase its potency and stretch the profits. It tastes terrible, burns going down, and probably causes as much harm as the problems people are trying to forget. But it works. For a few hours, the cold doesn't bite quite as hard. The hunger doesn't gnaw quite as insistently. The fear and worry fade to a manageable hum instead of the screaming chorus that usually fills your head. Walk into one of these gin palaces now. The contrast with the street outside is jarring. Gas lamps illuminate the interior with a warm, golden glow. The bar is polished wood, gleaming. There are mirrors on the walls, making the space seem larger, more luxurious. It's all carefully calculated to appeal to people who have nothing, to make them feel, for just a moment, like they've stepped into a different world. The customers lean against the bar or sit at rough tables, drinking rapidly, their faces flushed from the alcohol. Some are laughing too loudly, that brittle laughter of people forcing gaiety. Others are silent, staring into their glasses with the blank expression of those who've given up. A woman in the corner is openly drunk, swaying on her stool, her words slurred as she tries to start a conversation with anyone who'll listen. She's a mother. She has 3 children back in her room, the oldest only 7 years old, left alone while she's here. Tomorrow, she'll hate herself for this. She'll wake up with a pounding head and a gnawing guilt, knowing she spent money on gin that should have bought food for her babies. But tomorrow is tomorrow. Right now, right this moment, the gin is warm in her belly, and she can't feel the shame that usually crushes her. Can you judge her? Would you do any better in her place? A man at the bar has just received his weekly wages. He knows he should take them home. His wife is waiting. His children are hungry. But the weight of responsibility is crushing, and the gin promises relief, so he buys another round, then another. By the time he stumbles out into the night, his pockets are nearly empty. The guilt will plague him, certainly. His wife's disappointment will wound him. His children's hollow eyes will haunt him. But for these few hours, he wasn't a failure. He was just a man having drinks with other men, laughing at crude jokes, feeling the pleasant buzz of intoxication. In the Rookeries, you take your moments of peace where you can find them, even knowing the price you'll pay tomorrow. Opium is here too, though less common than gin because it's more expensive. Some people smoke it in dens, hidden in the deepest parts of the Rookeries, places where police never venture. The smoke is thick and sweet, nothing like the acrid smell of tobacco. The users lie on wooden bunks, their eyes half closed, their bodies slack, transported to places far from this hell. For some, opium is medicinal. It's one of the few effective painkillers available, and people use it to cope with chronic pain from injuries or diseases. For others, it's purely escapism. And for many, the line between medicine and addiction is so blurred as to be meaningless. If you're finding this hard to watch, imagine living it. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on how we treat the vulnerable in our own time. But life in the Rookeries isn't only suffering. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding moments of joy even in the darkest circumstances. On Sundays, when most people don't work, the courtyards sometimes come alive with a different energy. Children play more freely, their laughter echoing off the walls. Women gather in small groups, sharing gossip and news, finding community in shared struggles. Men sit on stoops, smoking cheap tobacco, talking about nothing and everything. Street musicians sometimes wander through, playing fiddles or accordions, and people dance, actually dance in those filthy courtyards, moving to music that drowns out, for just a moment, the misery that surrounds them. There are small acts of kindness too, moments of humanity that shine all the brighter for their setting. A woman sharing her meagre portion of bread with a neighbour whose children are hungrier than her own. A man teaching a young boy to read, using a scrap of newspaper and a piece of charcoal to form letters. Women sitting beside sick neighbours through long nights, offering the comfort of presence when nothing else can be offered. These acts don't change the fundamental reality of Rookery life, but they make it bearable. They remind people that they're still human, still capable of compassion and connection. Some people do escape the Rookeries. It's rare, but it happens. A young man might save his pennies for years and eventually accumulate enough to move to a slightly better neighbourhood, to rent a room in a building that's merely decrepit rather than ruinous. A girl might marry someone with slightly better prospects, a skilled tradesman or a clerk, and move up a rung on the economic ladder. A family might receive an unexpected windfall, an inheritance from a distant relative, or an employer who takes pity and offers better wages. These stories of escape are treasured in the Rookeries, told and retold, held up as proof that improvement is possible. But they're exceptions, not rules. For every person who escapes, 100 remain trapped. The children born in the Rookeries face particularly stark futures. Most will never attend school, despite the existence of charity schools and ragged schools designed specifically for poor children. Work claims them too early. A child who starts working at age 6 or 7 has no time for education. By the time they reach adolescence, illiteracy is permanent. They can't read. They can't write. They can do basic arithmetic maybe, enough to count coins and avoid being cheated by employers. But complex mathematics is beyond them. This lack of education virtually guarantees they'll remain trapped in unskilled, low-wage labour for their entire lives. They'll repeat their parents' existence, struggling in the same ways, facing the same impossible choices. And their children will face the same fate. Some children go to work in factories, those dark, satanic mills that drive Britain's industrial revolution. Picture a textile mill now. It's enormous, several stories tall, hundreds of looms clattering away in deafening cacophony. The air is thick with cotton fibre that floats everywhere, coating everything, filling your lungs with every breath. The workers, many of them children, move between the machines, their hands flying as they tie broken threads, replace empty bobbins, adjust tensions. The machinery never stops, never. Even when someone is injured, even when a child's hand gets caught in the mechanisms and they're screaming as their fingers are crushed or severed, the machines keep running. Time is money. Stopping production costs profits. The child's suffering is irrelevant to the ledger. A girl of perhaps 10 works at one of the looms. She's been here since dawn. Will be here until well after dark. 14 hours. maybe 16. She gets one short break for lunch, barely enough time to choke down whatever stale bread she brought from home. Her feet ache from standing on the hard floor. Her head pounds from the constant noise. Her hands are bleeding from the rough thread. But she doesn't complain. Complaint means dismissal, and dismissal means her family loses the 3 shillings she earns each week. So she works. She keeps working even when exhaustion makes her sway on her feet. She keeps working even when her vision blurs from fatigue. And when the inevitable happens, when exhaustion slows her reflexes and her hand moves a fraction too slowly and gets caught in the machinery, she screams. The sound is lost in the general roar. Her hand is mangled, 2 fingers severed cleanly, the others crushed. Blood sprays across the white cotton, staining it red. The foreman comes, curses, pulls her away from the machine. They wrap her hand in rags, not gently, then send her home. No compensation, no medical care, just dismissal. She's useless to them now, damaged goods. She'll never work in a factory again. How will she survive? How will her family survive? These questions hang in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. Other children work as chimney sweeps. Imagine being 4 or 5 years old and being forced to climb inside a chimney, a narrow, dark shaft, barely wide enough for your small body. The walls are rough brick, covered in soot and creosote that scrapes your skin raw as you climb. It's completely dark. You can't see anything. You can only feel your way upward, your hands and feet finding purchase on the rough surfaces, your body contorting to fit through spaces that become narrower the higher you climb. Your lungs burn from breathing the soot-filled air. Your eyes sting and water. Sometimes you get stuck, your body wedged so tightly you can't move up or down, and you hang there in the darkness, panic rising as you struggle to breathe. Sometimes the sweep master lights a fire below to motivate you to climb faster, and you scramble upward, terrified, the heat and smoke chasing you. Some children die in the chimneys, either from asphyxiation or from falls, or from getting stuck and never being found. Their bodies are sometimes discovered years later, small skeletons crouched in the darkness, forgotten. Life on the streets offers its own particular hardships. Thousands of children live rough in Victorian London, sleeping in doorways or under bridges, surviving by theft, begging, prostitution, or any combination thereof. They move in gangs for protection, the older ones looking after the younger, teaching them the skills they need to survive. How to spot a mark, how to pick a pocket, how to run fast enough to escape pursuit, how to find food, stealing from market stalls, scavenging through garbage, catching rats to roast over fires, how to find shelter, breaking into abandoned buildings, crawling into sewer pipes, huddling in groups for warmth on winter nights when the cold can literally kill you. Watch that boy there, maybe 12 years old, scanning the crowd near a market. His clothes are rags held together with string. His feet are bare, the soles hardened to leather by years of walking on rough ground. His hair is a matted mess, his face smeared with dirt. He's looking for an opportunity. There, a well-dressed gentleman stopping to examine some fruit. The man's attention is focused on the vendor. The boy moves, smooth as silk, his small fingers dipping into the man's coat pocket, emerging with a wallet. The whole operation takes perhaps 3 seconds. The boy is already walking away casually, not running. Never running unless you're being chased, because running attracts attention. He'll hand the wallet to an older boy in his gang who'll fence it, and they'll split the proceeds. Maybe 6pence for him. Enough to eat today. Enough to rent a corner of a doss house floor tonight so he doesn't have to sleep on the street. Tomorrow, he'll do it all again. But the risks are enormous. Get caught, and you're going before a magistrate. Theft is a serious crime, even for children. Especially for children, actually, because Victorian society believes that harsh punishment will deter criminal behaviour. A child convicted of theft might be sent to a reformatory, which sounds benign, but is essentially prison with religious instruction. Harsh discipline, physical punishment, monotonous work designed to break your spirit. Or worse, transportation to Australia, shipped off to the other side of the world, never to see your family or friends again. and for the most serious offences or for repeat offenders, hanging. They hang children in Victorian England. Not frequently and not for minor crimes, but it happens. The logic is deterrence. The reality is that children keep stealing because hunger is more immediate than fear of distant punishment. The Rookeries also house another population, those who've fallen from higher social positions. Bankrupts, disgraced professionals, women who've lost their reputations. These people suffer perhaps even more than those born into poverty because they remember what life was like before. They know what they've lost, and that knowledge is its own special torment. A former shopkeeper who made a series of bad investments and lost everything. A clerk who was fired for some minor infraction or simply because his employer found a cheaper replacement. A governess dismissed without references, effectively unemployable in respectable society. They end up in the Rookeries because nowhere else will take them, and they live in a kind of liminal space, too educated and refined to fully adapt to Rookery life, but too poor to escape it. There's a man in St. Giles who was once a doctor. Not a fashionable West End doctor, but a respectable general practitioner with a modest practice in a middling neighbourhood. Then his wife died in childbirth, along with their baby. Grief consumed him. He began drinking. His practice suffered. Patients left. Debts accumulated. Eventually, he lost his licence to practice. Now he lives in a rookery room, supporting himself by performing illegal medical services, treating the sick poor who can't afford proper doctors, performing abortions for desperate women, occasionally setting broken bones or stitching wounds for criminals who can't risk going to a hospital. He's technically still saving lives, still using his medical knowledge, but it's a terrible parody of the life he once lived. He drinks heavily to forget, and he knows he'll die here, in this filthy room, probably of liver failure or alcohol poisoning. A cautionary tale about how quickly respectability can crumble. The Rookeries are also sites of political radicalism. When you have nothing to lose, when the system has made it abundantly clear that it considers you expendable, revolution starts to sound appealing. Throughout the Victorian period, various movements organise in the Rookeries. Chartists demanding political reforms. Trade unionists fighting for workers' rights. Socialists and communists advocating for the complete overthrow of the capitalist system. The authorities watch these movements nervously because they understand the powder keg they're sitting on. Tens of thousands of desperate people crowded into small areas, united by shared suffering and shared resentment of a society that treats them as less than human. It wouldn't take much to ignite that anger into violence. And violence does erupt sometimes. Food riots when bread prices spike, attacks on workhouses that symbolise everything people hate about the poor relief system. Mob actions against unpopular landlords or rent collectors. The violence is usually unfocused, burning hot and then extinguishing quickly, but it terrifies the middle and upper classes. They build their grand narratives about civilization and progress, while the people in the Rookeries, the people who produce the goods and build the buildings and work the docks that make that progress possible, live in conditions that mock every claim to civilization. The contradiction is glaring. Victorian society recognises it, sometimes, in brief moments of conscience. Then they look away, because actually addressing the problem would require fundamental changes to economic and social systems that benefit those in power. Charity exists. There are people who genuinely care and genuinely try to help. Religious organisations operate missions in the Rookeries, offering soup kitchens, basic medical care, education for children. The Salvation Army becomes famous for their work among the poor. Various philanthropists fund housing projects, model dwellings designed to provide better living conditions at affordable rents. These efforts help some people. They save some lives. But they're drops in an ocean of need. For every family housed in a model dwelling, 100 remain in the Rookeries. For every child educated at a ragged school, 100 work in factories and never learn to read. The scope of the problem is so vast that individual charity, no matter how well-intentioned, can't solve it. Some reformers recognise this. They write articles and books describing conditions in the Rookeries, trying to shock the comfortable classes into action. Charles Dickens sets parts of Oliver Twist in the Rookeries, giving readers a glimpse of that world. Henry Mayhew conducts extensive interviews with London's poor, documenting their lives in exhaustive detail. These works create awareness, certainly. They influence public opinion. But awareness doesn't automatically translate into action. Reading about poverty is different from experiencing it. People can feel sympathy, even pity, while still believing that poverty is fundamentally the fault of the poor themselves, that if they just worked harder or made better choices, they could escape. This belief allows society to avoid uncomfortable questions about systemic inequality. The Rookeries begin to change in the later Victorian period, but not through benevolence. They're destroyed, cleared. The land is too valuable to waste on slums. Railways need routes through central London. New roads need to be built. Developers see profit in raising the Rookeries and building commercial properties, so the authorities move in with demolition crews. The buildings are torn down. The residents are evicted, given little or no compensation, no help finding new housing. They scatter to other areas, overcrowding neighbourhoods that were already struggling, creating new slums to replace the old ones. The problems don't disappear. They just move, becoming someone else's problem. Jacob's Island, one of London's most notorious rookeries, gets cleared in the 1860s. St Giles is demolished gradually over several decades. The old nickel survives until the 1890s. Each clearance is hailed as progress, as improvement, as civilization reclaiming ground from barbarism. But for the people displaced, it's catastrophe. They lose their homes, their communities, their survival networks. Yes, those homes were terrible. Yes, those communities existed in conditions that should shock any conscience. But they were homes nonetheless. They were survival. And when they're destroyed without providing adequate alternatives, the suffering just compounds. As night falls over the Rookeries, a different atmosphere emerges. Daytime has its own horrors, certainly, but nighttime is when the Rookeries become truly dangerous. The narrow alleys disappear into complete darkness. There's no street lighting here. The authorities don't waste gas on illuminating slums. Only scattered light from candles and fires in the rooms above provides any visibility, and that light is dim and flickering, creating more shadows than illumination. Sound takes on new significance when you can't see. Footsteps echo off the close walls. Voices carry strangely, distorted by the acoustic properties of the architecture. Every sound might be a threat or might be nothing. The predators emerge at night. Criminals who consider even robbery too tame, who prefer violence for its own sake or for the small amounts of money the victims might carry. Drunks stumbling home from gin palaces, aggressive and unpredictable. The desperately poor who've decided that stealing from their equally poor neighbours is preferable to starvation. Women and children are particularly vulnerable. Walking through the Rookeries at night without male protection is taking your life in your hands. Rape and assault are common. Bodies are found in the alleys with disturbing regularity, murdered for the few coins in their pockets, or for no reason at all beyond the killer's twisted impulses. But people still move through the darkness because they have no choice. Night workers returning home from shifts. Women coming back from cleaning jobs in wealthier neighbourhoods. Children sent on errands that couldn't wait until morning. They move quickly, nervously, their senses alert for any hint of danger. They stick to the slightly more travelled routes when possible, avoiding the dead-end courts and the darkest passages. They carry whatever makeshift weapons they can, a stick, a knife, even just a stone clutched in a hand. Not that these would help much against determined attackers, but they provide some small psychological comfort. Sleep, when it comes, is restless. The Rookery never truly goes quiet. Babies cry. People argue. Someone somewhere is always coughing, that deep, wet cough of consumption or bronchitis. Rats scurry through walls and across floors. The buildings themselves creak and groan, settling on their failing foundations. And underlying everything is the awareness that danger exists just beyond your door, that the separation between your family and violence or death, or any number of other horrors, is just a few planks of wood that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. Morning comes, and the cycle begins again. The same struggles, the same choices, the same daily battle against hunger, disease, cold, and despair. This is not living. This is surviving, and barely that. This is human beings reduced to the absolute minimum of existence, stripped of dignity, of comfort, of hope. This is what happens when economic systems prioritize profit over people, when society decides that some lives matter less than others. When the wealthy and powerful turn their eyes away from suffering they could alleviate but choose not to. Could we create something like the Rookeries again? Could modern society allow such conditions to exist? Before you answer too quickly, think carefully. Look around. Look at the homeless encampments in wealthy cities. Look at the slums that still exist across the world. Look at how we treat refugees, prisoners, the mentally ill. The Rookeries were extreme, yes, but the impulse that created them, the willingness to discard human beings deemed economically unproductive, that impulse didn't die with Victorian London. It just takes new forms. The people who lived in the Rookeries were not fundamentally different from you or me. They weren't morally inferior or intellectually deficient or deserving of their fate. They were people who had the misfortune to be born into poverty or who fell into it through circumstances largely beyond their control. They loved their children and wanted better for them. They took pride in their work when they could. They helped their neighbours. They found moments of joy amid the suffering. They were fully human, with all the complexity and dignity that humanity implies. The Rookeries stripped away the external markers of that humanity: clean clothes, adequate food, comfortable housing, but they couldn't destroy the essential humanity itself. Remember their names. We don't actually know most of their names, which is its own tragedy. History records the names of the wealthy, the powerful, the notable. It forgets the poor. But they existed. They suffered. They mattered. Every child who died of cholera in a Rookery cellar mattered. Every mother who worked herself to death trying to feed her family mattered. Every man who broke his body in brutal labour and died young and unmourned mattered. They were real people who lived real lives, and those lives deserve to be remembered, even if we don't know their specific names. The Rookeries are gone now. The buildings were demolished more than a century ago. The neighbourhoods have been rebuilt, gentrified, transformed beyond recognition. You can walk through central London today and never know that certain streets were once the sites of human misery so profound, it's difficult to comprehend. But we should know. We should remember. Because the forces that created the Rookeries still exist. Inequality still exists. Poverty still exists. The willingness to ignore suffering when acknowledging it would be inconvenient still exists. And if we forget what happened in the Rookeries, if we forget how bad things can get when society decides that some people's welfare simply doesn't matter, we risk allowing it to happen again. So what can you take from this? What lessons remain relevant more than a century after the last Rookery was demolished? Perhaps this: that human dignity is not conditional on economic status. That every person deserves the basic necessities of life: food, shelter, safety, medical care, not because they've earned them, but because they're human. That societies should be judged not by the wealth of their richest citizens, but by the treatment of their poorest. That turning away from suffering doesn't make it disappear. It just makes us complicit in it. The Victorian Rookeries represented a failure of economic systems that enriched a few while impoverishing many. A failure of political systems that denied voice and power to those most affected by policy decisions. A failure of moral imagination that allowed comfortable people to justify their comfort while others suffered. But within that failure, there was also resilience, strength, humanity persisting against terrible odds, people helping each other even when they had almost nothing, parents loving their children, communities forming even in the worst conditions. That resilience, that determination to maintain humanity in inhuman circumstances, is perhaps the real story of the Rookeries. If this video has affected you, If you're sitting there shocked or angry or moved, good. That's the appropriate response. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if you see parallels to modern situations. Tell me if this has changed how you think about poverty and inequality. These conversations matter. These stories matter. And I want to thank you for watching, for bearing witness to this dark chapter of history. If you want to support this channel and help us create more in-depth historical documentaries like this, consider leaving a super thanks or subscribing. Hit that like button if you found this valuable and share it with someone who needs to see it. The Rookeries may be gone, but their lessons remain. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them, whether we're willing to look at the suffering that exists in our own time and place and ask ourselves the hard questions. What are we willing to tolerate? What are we willing to ignore? And what are we willing to do about it? The people of the Rookeries couldn't answer those questions for themselves because they had no power. But we do. We have voices. We have votes. We have choices. What will we do with them? That's the real question this history poses. Not what happened then, but what happens now. Not what they did, but what we do. The Rookeries are history, but their challenge to our conscience is eternal.